Welcome to SportsLit. I'm Neil Acharya.
I am Nate Sager.
Our listeners may be surprised today to hear that our guest is Paul Romanuk, a name that has been intertwined with sports broadcasting in Canada since the 1980s. After all, this is SportsLit, a podcast about sports books and interviewing athletes and authors. Well, I was surprised too when I found out a few months ago that he had a long-standing series with Scholastic titled Hockey Superstars that has been released yearly for over 30 years since the 1986-87 season. So yes, in a year of diverse titles and stories on the program, we will chat about a release aimed at primary school-aged kids who love hockey. Romanuk, the author, or better yet, curator of this latest edition, Hockey Superstars 2020-2021, released, and that was released on October 6th, the traditional start window of the NHL season. He profiles 17 NHL dynamos with bios, stats, and quotes over 27 pages. That's where you'll find Connor McDavid, who graces the cover, as well as Austin Matthews and 15 others. There's also data on next-generation sensations like top draft picks Alexis Lafreniere and Quinton Byfield. Romanuk was, of course, a play-by-play commentator on Hockey Night in Canada from 2014 to 2018, and a staple at TSN, where he began his sports broadcasting career in 1985 as a freelancer, just 1 year after the network was launched. His full-time tenure at Canada's first all-sports network lasted from 1987 to 2001. For those that are interested in the business side of things, Romanuk was also the co-executive producer of the Spengler Cup from 2002 to 2013, as well as a play-by-play commentator. And so no, Bobcat Bob McCown isn't the only guy in front of the mic to have wet his beak in the business side of the industry. In addition to his lengthy international broadcasting resume, Romanuk also called Toronto Raptors games during the locked-out NHL season of 04-05. And just a few months ago, he launched his Beatles-themed podcast, The Walrus Was Paul, under his Romicast banner. Before we get to him, I'll pass it over to my fellow fool on the hill, Nate Sager.
Hey, I reference my ears applaud, Neil. Hockey Superstars is a MacGuffin for our purposes, but you understand why it has enduring appeal. We get to be jaded adults about sports, but through, Paul Romanuk's capsule characterizations about how Connor McDavid came back from major knee surgery to, put up huge numbers last season, or how, the Colorado Avalanche's Nathan MacKinnon has gradually learned to put the team ahead of personal goals. You can see how sports can still set an example for growing minds. It is cool, it's still going strong in 2020 when the NHL bears little resemblance to the 21-team era when we were growing up. It definitely brings one back to being that age. I think since I have a birthday close to Christmas, there was 1 year I got 3 copies of Hockey Superstars. Although unlike Jane Kirkovich-Williams on the sitcom Happy Endings, at least my parents never ruined my childhood with the dreaded Christmas birthday combo gift, which forced me to fabricate a summer birthday, which, really matches my easy breezy vibe.
Easy breezy vibe. Aren't you still working on that email about why Dave Stieb belongs in the Baseball Hall of Fame? Been at it for some time.
Stieb is ahead of Whitey Ford in wins above replacement for pitchers. You could look it up. Anywho, Romanuk is the voice in many people's heads when they think back to the World Under-20 Hockey Championship in the 1990s, before it really had that elaborate scaffolding from the broadcaster and the sponsors that's lifted it into Canada's version of March Madness. Sports likers north of age 40, hello, remember Paul calling those games that they probably watched with parents and grandparents during their holiday break from school, and it probably comes to mind as a purer experience than what it is today. Now, typically, someone who gets to that high in sports broadcasting in Canada is just ensconced like Costanza and Velvet. Job for life, calling big games till you call it a day, eh? But Paul's had a unique path. As I've heard people say, hey, it's kind of like he went away for a while, since he, left, the rat race of Canadian sports broadcasting, spent 9 years in England after he and his spouse Carrie moved there for the enhancement of her career. And he sort of came back to do Hockey Night in Canada, as you mentioned, Neil. That ground's kind of been well-tilled in other forums. I always like it when we can give people a respite from the noise, ask them about some different things. As you alluded to, he's got the Walrus Was Paul podcast, where he chats with heavy hitters in Canadian music, such as Jim Cuddy of Blue Rodeo, Jane Gowan of The Real Shade, and Tyler Stewart of the Bare Naked Ladies. And they just go deep on one Beatles album or their other projects, and it's mind blowing that they can. You think, how do they get 2 hours talking about one album? But he's got people who can talk about arrangements and vocal tracking and all of the production innovations that George Martin came up with. I definitely have learned a lot from the episodes I've heard, since basically all of my Beatles knowledge comes from Simpsons references. Popular music's none of my business, so I never think too critically about music or other people's taste in it. It's kind of like the Paul McCartney and Wings song, Live and Let Live.
Live and Let Die, like the movie.
Whatever, it had a catchy rhythm. So yeah, Romanuk has always given off a vibe that there's, a lot more about him than having, pulled on a Hockey Night in Canada headset. In some ways, he was, the right guy in the right place at the right time. To have come out of Ryerson in 1984, right as TSN launched. I've heard him mention that to other podcasters. But, in terms of, his skill set and range of interest, he was probably a little ahead of his time, too. Because being able to cross over between sports and pop culture was not so much of a thing, 20, 25 years ago. But now there's a little more room to indulge all your tastes rather than just having to stay in one stream. We found out it's not the worst thing to have to cross the streams. So we're grateful, Paul Romanuk's joining us today, although we have no craft beer for him. Pa-rumpa-pum-pum.
Release the hounds. Time to chat with the international man of play calling, Paul Romanuk. And we're back with Paul Romanuk, and we're going to talk about hockey superstars and other things. Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much. Very nice to talk to you guys, and I appreciate you taking time out to talk to me.
Yeah, so I want to ask you, I guess I did have a question lined up, but I'll ask, first of all, what's the genesis of this series, the Hockey Superstars, that you've put out since 86, 87? It's been a long time running, to borrow the line from a famous lyric.
It's a lovely story that I never get tired of telling, and I'll try not to drag it on too. In the early days of my career, I was a runner for Hockey Night in Canada. And one of the hosts at the time was a lovely gentleman and a prolific author by the name of Brian McFarlane. And Brian and I, I guess he was a bit of a mentor at the time to me in that career, or probably more accurately, he was just a guy who didn't mind helping out young up-and-coming broadcasters. And Brian mentioned to me at one point during a show, he said, "Look, goes, I'm working on this hockey book, and I could use a little bit of help with some research. Would you be interested in doing that?" I said, "Yes, of course." So I took the bus up to Brian's place in North Toronto somewhere, and I went up and went into his basement, and he had this huge archive of old hockey books and magazines. And long story short is I helped him do some research for a hockey book that he was doing. So that was fine. And then probably several months, maybe even a year later, Brian mentioned to me that he was going for a meeting with his publishers at Scholastic, and did I want to come along? And I said, yeah, sure. He goes, well, you might learn something. So what happened was we went to this meeting with the good people at Scholastic, and they had a proposal, unbeknownst to me, that they'd made to Brian. They wanted him to do a book called Hockey Superstars, which is essentially the book that's still done today. And Brian, again, unbeknownst to me, and I understood putting the pieces together why he wanted me there, said, well, look, he goes, I don't really have time to do this because I've got my Hockey Night in Canada job and lots of other things on the go. But this young man here has helped me with another book, and I've worked with him, and I know that he could do the job for you. So he essentially, kind of set the whole thing up, and that is how it started. The next thing I knew, I was doing the first Hockey Superstars book, and it's been a lovely relationship with the people at Scholastic. But thanks to Brian McFarlane.
Do you maintain contact with Brian? And he was just named to the Order of Canada on November 27th. So, I mean, you mentioned who he was and a little bit about how the book project started, but, for some of our listeners, maybe a little younger that didn't get to see him on Hockey Night in Canada, yeah, and he's also done 90 books, I think. If the MLA that did the congratulations for him in Parliament, that's what they refer to, 90 books. So if that's correct, that's a hell of a lot of books. But yeah, tell me about, or tell the viewers that don't, or listeners that don't know about Brian McFarland and his relationship with Hockey Night in Canada, who he was a little bit.
Well, Brian was a guy, he's from the same era as Dave Hodge, who, Dave Hodge, for those of you who are younger, Dave Hodge at one time was Ron McLean, if you will, or Ron McLean is now Dave Hodge, host of Hockey Night in Canada, and Brian was also a Hockey Night in Canada host, so this will be back in the 70s. And Brian was also a prolific author. It ran in the family. I believe his father was the author of the Hardy Boys Mysteries books.
Right.
And so he came by it honestly, and he's also a dedicated hockey historian, and he's written many books about hockey history. He at one time had quite a collection of hockey artifacts, and he had them in sort of a portable hockey museum, if you will, that he would drive around to various local fairs. So I mean, he's just a wonderful, lovely man, and like many of us in the broadcasting business, he kind of got screwed out of his role as a broadcaster and then into early retirement and ended up continuing to write for many, many years. Peter Puck was something that he was involved with. He was trying to resurrect the Peter Puck cartoon in cooperation with Hanna-Barbera. So, I mean, you could do a whole podcast on Brian McFarland. But that, in a nutshell, is Brian. He was a hockey historian, a broadcaster, and also a writer. And I fell out of touch with him, but I reached out to him about a year ago and just said, hey, Brian, it's been a long time. I'm ever so grateful for the favor you did me 30 plus years ago that has resulted in just a great relationship and something I enjoy with the Hockey Superstar series. Let's get together and have lunch. And he said, absolutely, love to do that. I'm in Florida for the winter, but we'll do it in the spring when I get back. Well, of course, what's happened? Right. And I haven't been able to get together with Brian to have that lunch. I hope to do it once we come out of this pandemic that we're all involved in, but I cannot say enough about the generosity and the kindness that a veteran guy showed towards a young kid.
Has a player ever told you they bought this for their kids? Any of the players you covered when you were doing Hockey Night?
They have indeed. I've had a few do that, and it's it was during my sort of second tour of duty in North America as a play-by-play announcer. I was at TSN for about 15 years, left, and then long story short, I came back to work for Hockey Night in Canada, and it was during my sort of return working on Hockey Night in Canada where I would bump into guys. There were a few of them, and said, "Hey, man, are you still doing those books?" And I used to get them as a kid, and I buy them now for my kid. And I mean, it makes you feel old, but more than that, it made me feel really proud. It just like that, so many kids had gotten their hands on those books, and it's still something. Every year, guys, I get. Sometimes snail mail and occasionally now emails from little kids. And the typical one, I think a lot of schools in the curriculum, you pick a book by an author and you write a letter to the author. And, of course, it's a book for very young readers. So the typical letter will be something like, "Dear Mr. Romanuk, I like your book. I like hockey. I like hockey and your book. Who is your favorite player? When will the Leafs win the cup? Please write back to me, signed, Jason or Janet or whatever the case." But I still love getting those letters.
Here's a review I found of the 06-07 installment, but it probably speaks to all of them. And I'm going to read it to you and then ask you if you know where this is from, okay? and now I'm not reading the full review, just part of it, but this book provides such quick, entertaining coverage of so many aspects of the NHL game that it will make both a perfect preseason primer for young people and an invaluable way to keep track of the goings-on during the campaign. It's easy to imagine author Romanuk as a super fan, eager to pass on his interest in the game to younger versions of himself with the series. And he's certainly done a fine job at that task. Now, that's not on the back of the book. That's an independent review. Do you know? Were you aware of that?
No, but it's lovely to hear that. I don't think the book is widely reviewed because it's not. I would never pass it off as serious literature. It's a book for young hockey fans, but I would echo what the reviewer said because when I started to do this, I was that kid, right? I've always maintained. I try to keep in mind my 10, 11, 12-year-old self when I'm doing this book. Now, a lot has changed since I started doing it. Social media, internet, all those things, of course. But the core thing of the book is something that I loved to do when I was a kid, and I think that young kids still like to do, and that is read a story about one of my favorite players, look at a great picture, but the unique thing about the book is that there's always been a section where the kid can keep track of how their favorite players and favorite teams are doing over the course of the season. And that's exactly what I did. I did it in a scrapbook, and I tried to give kids sort of marry the two together. And the number of those books that I've seen with little kids who brought them up to me to sign, where they'll open it up and they have all of the interactive sections filled in their handwriting. It makes me so happy because that is what I intended it to be all along. So I'm glad the reviewer picked up on that.
Well, the reviewer, that's from Quill and Quire. I mean, so when I saw that, I said, oh wow, I wouldn't have expected Quill and Quire, as you said. I expect them to review more like traditional types of literature, but obviously it resonates enough, and it's been going on long enough for them to put that review in.
Yeah, and now
that's cool. Love it. Yeah.
And of course, the easiest part of a writer or a coach's job is the cuts. What's the formula for deciding which players you're going to profile in each new edition?
It's fairly straightforward at this point. I mean, right off the bat, you have, of course, you've got. When Wayne Gretzky was a prominent guy in the league, you knew every year Wayne Gretzky was going to be in the book. Right now, to bring it up to modern times, Connor McDavid's going to be in the book every year, right? Alex Ovechkin's going to be in the book most. And you can sort of go down the list of the, absolutely will be in the books. But then after that, what we really try to do, because the book sells it does sell in the United States, but it sells primarily in Canada, both through trade and also in school book clubs. And so what I try to do is have a representation, at least one player from each and every Canadian team. And then after that, I sort of try to use my knowledge of the game to take a guess at who I think has a pretty good shot at winning Rookie of the Year, and maybe the Norris Trophy is the best defenseman in the league, maybe the Vezina is the best goaltender, and try to nail that. Some years you get it, some years you don't, but that's sort of the formula. So the superstars who are guarantees, the representation from the Canadian teams, as well as a couple of key award winners in there. Or another thing I like to do is, if it looks as though, off the top of my head, looks as though Tampa is really going to take a run at the Cup. So there's a good chance that they'll win the Cup or they'll at least be in the final. Well, we've got to get at least one guy in there from Tampa, to use that as an example. So that's sort of in a nutshell. The odd time you'll break form. It'll be a year where there'll be a Canadian team that'll just be horrendous, and you can't justify putting a player in from that team, and that happens. But for the most part, I try to cover all the Canadian clubs.
Did you ever run into a problem when the Leafs were so bad for so long with that from a marketability standpoint?
Well, it's funny you bring that up because I send my prospective list in usually in a normal season around this time of year. So to say, send it into the lovely lady who I've worked with there by the name of Diane Kerner. I'll send Diane the list, and then the next stage is she goes in and takes it to the weekly or bi-weekly marketing meeting or whatever it is. So that's when you'll get the pushback saying, oh well, we've got to have of course, like just as is the case on TV and in print, the Leafs sell. So no matter how bad the Leafs are, the marketers would want a Leaf in. But there were a few years there where I stood my ground and I said, no, they're horrible. Like there's nobody on the team that's possibly worth putting in. So we can. And the book still sold. But there's nothing like a hockey book with, in the day, Doug Gilmour in a Leaf uniform, Matt Sundin in a Leaf uniform, more recently Austin Matthews in a Leaf uniform. Those are all, those are going to be big sales drivers. But yes, you get the usual push me, pull you with the marketers.
So since this is an annual series, how is the the bubble season that just happened and the proposed, I guess, shortened season that will happen, how is that going to affect how you proceed with Scholastic in putting out the next versions of this series?
Well, it's a weird year. What we did with this year's book, because we couldn't. Usually, what we like to do is put in, the final standings, the final results from the playoffs, the award winners, and so on. We couldn't do that, so I wrote a foreword in the front of the book saying, go. They set up a website to go, and we filled all that information in as it became available. So that was an adaptation we had to make for this year. For the upcoming year, I think we'll be okay once they get the season going. But the issue will be, again, in the normal year, by the time I put my list together of prospects to be in the following year's book, you're a halfway through the season, so you can kind of see patterns emerging and take a pretty good educated guess. I've watched a lot of hockey over the years. I won't have that luxury this year because we won't be as far into the season. Now, on the positive side of things, when I started doing this book back in the mid-late 80s, the book was printed in Hong Kong, and my print deadline, editorial deadline, was before the end of the season. So it's funny going back and reading those books because you write in these sort of vague generalities, and because that's all you could do. That was the technology of the day. Now you can make changes right up until the day before it's going to go to print, and it doesn't go to print now until August. So the season will be over and done and dusted before it has to go to print. So I think, to long answer your question, I suspect what I'll end up doing is there'll be a lot more revisions as we go. But because of the technology now, that's completely doable. Whereas back when I started doing this, the manuscript was being sent in double-spaced type pages. So it was a while ago.
Well, I'm glad you brought up technology, because there is a letter in this book to the kids that read it, and it says, hey, listen, this is what happened, essentially referring to the bubble season, and you can go online and find more resources, and there's the web link, scholastic.ca/hockey superstars, I think it is. So going forward, bubble seasons aside and shortened pandemic affected seasons aside, do you feel like there'll be more interplay with the web and the book going forward into the next I guess few years, just given how ingrained technology is in everything right now?
That's a good question. I wish I could give you a definitive answer. In the one sense, it's allowed us to do exactly what you talked about. Put the author's note in the opening of this year's and say, hey, we don't have all the up-to-date information, but you can go here to this web page and we'll update it for you. And there's sort of a marrying of old technology and new technology, which I'm all for. But then, having said that, as you guys would know, I mean, books are still, comfortingly to many people, a book is still a very analog process. You sit there and you read the printed word, be that off a tablet or off, a piece of paper, a printed page. And I don't know that'll ever change. I think the book is what it is. It's an annual, and it's as absolutely in normal years as up to date as it can be. It takes into account award winners and the Stanley Cup winner and the conclusion of the previous season, and wraps it all up nicely and previews the upcoming year. And I kind of think that's enough for most young kids. But I could be wrong. I don't have a young child. Maybe they'd like something on, Snapchat, on any of the instant message things, that, like all that stuff that I don't participate in because of my age, partly. I don't know. I don't have a definitive answer for that.
And with writing for that young audience, how much do you sort of look for the thing that makes that player like relatable to a young kid who is trying to go find inspiration? I think of how I think the McDavid capsule in this year emphasized how he came back from a knee injury and still put up almost a 1.5 points per game last year.
Yeah, I mean, I try to go for stories that are, for obvious reasons, relatable to young kids. And they tend to be stories about overcoming obstacles, perseverance, displays of exceptionally good character, sportsmanship. The ongoing theme I think we like to stress to young athletes is that you can work hard. Sometimes it pays off. Sometimes it doesn't. You work hard. You don't always win. You win with pride. You lose with dignity. All of those things. And I look for stories like that. So the Connor McDavid one is a good example of that. And then again, for many other stories, I'll talk about the start for a player, where he grew up and how he learned to play the game and who his heroes might have been. And I try to keep the themes, relatable to a kid, and I hope something that's going to provide a bit of inspiration for a young hockey player.
Paul, I'm going to segue now into the broadcast portion of your career, and I want to ask if you could paint the picture for our listeners and for both myself and Nate of, I guess, the setting of a young Paul Romanuk at Ryerson, and you and your classmates becoming aware of this new all-sports station on the horizon called TSN. I mean, what was before TSN? What were the options for you in sports broadcasting and your classmates?
Well, they were surprisingly varied. In terms of television sports, it was, the place where you wanted to be was CBC. You wanted CBC Sports. That they were the kings. They had Hockey Night in Canada. They had the Olympics. They had the CFL mostly. Anything that was big was on. They had Sports Weekend. It was the big iconic sports brand. CTV also had a pretty strong brand. They had CTV's Wide World of Sports, which was kind of a ripoff of ABC's Wide World of Sports in the U.S., but done with some Canadian flavor. So you also had CTV. But the thing that you had back then for options is, back in that era, we're talking early mid '80s, when I graduated from Ryerson, every local radio and TV station, and there were way more of them in Canada. This is before Rogers and Bell sort of got their paws onto everything and gradually started to consolidate and close down and eliminate jobs, which they continue to do in order to save money. So, but when I used to early days go and work as a stringer for broadcast news, which was the broadcast end of Canadian press, I would go and interview players after the games and feed the tape back down a phone line to be distributed to affiliates. And I would go and sit in the press box at the old Maple Leaf Gardens, and there would be 10 to a dozen reporters there from radio stations. Go down, every radio station didn't just have a sports reporter. They had a sports department. And likewise for news, and likewise for local television affiliates. So those were your options coming out of school. Now the TSN thing, I don't recall that any of us were following it particularly closely. But then all of a sudden, at that time, right when my cohort graduated in the autumn or the fall of that year, was the first time that you had pay TV channels launched in Canada. So you had TSN, a sports channel. You had Much Music, music video channel. There were a couple of movie channels. There was an arts channel off the top of my head. So that was a great time. But it's not like we were all sitting there near the end of our final year at Ryerson, so that would have been in the spring of 1984, going, wow, it's going to be great. There's going to be this all-sports channel. I don't think we knew that much about it. Now, when it hit, a lot of my colleagues quickly found work there, and I followed suit shortly thereafter. But it wasn't like it was this big anticipated thing, because there were a fair number of options out there for you when you graduated back then.
I was imagining, I'm glad you clarified that, because I was imagining it was probably similar to when the Athletic kind of emerged a few years ago. It seemed to be, hey, there's this thing to go to. But yeah, as you say, there were a lot of options locally before consolidation. So yeah, so thank you for that. I want to move forward into your career, and by the 90s. One of the storylines that struck me was, the Eric Lindros storm. And by the time you're firmly entrenched at TSN, after you got hired on as a full-timer in 87, there's this storm around this kid from Oshawa where you're from. And I was just wondering how you thought, the hyper coverage, TSN then has the 24-hour sports news cycle, what role TSN had in showcasing the Eric Lindros circus, and maybe how you factored into that.
Well, as timing worked out, I had front row seat because I can remember traveling down to Detroit to do a story on Eric when I was a sports desk reporter. So this was prior to him coming back even to play in the Ontario Hockey League. So Eric and I, at that time, well, we still do, but go back a long way. And then it was just sort of coincidence the way my career was going and the way his was going. TSN started covering junior hockey in a big way in the 1991 season. Bob McKenzie and I, it was CHL Sunday Night was launched on TSN, and it was the first time there was a weekly coast-to-coast Canadian junior hockey game on television, and I was behind that with in a production role, but also on the air with Bob McKenzie as the color guy, and that coincided with Eric's entry into the Ontario Hockey League, and then playing for the Oshawa Generals, and going back a long way. But Mike Ricci was also a star in Peterborough, and so to answer your question, I called a lot of those games, and subsequently, I was a host in the World Junior when he was with Team Canada in Saskatoon that year, and then the following year we were in Fusen, and I was calling play-by-play, and he was also playing in the OHL. So yeah, our paths crossed a lot, and right up to draft day, when I was the first guy who interviewed him after he got drafted. I was the reporter on the TSN broadcast, and they called his name, and Eric came walking down. I had a pretty good relationship with the guy at that time, and he walked over, and I did the interview with him, and then it kind of came full circle in that way during my last year doing NHL play-by-play, when we were doing a regional Leafs game in Philadelphia, and it was Eric Lindros night. He was being inducted into the Philadelphia Flyers Hall of Fame. And I saw Eric. He came into the broadcast booth between periods and gave him a hug, and it was just like, man, it's funny how life comes full circle. So yeah, those are fantastic times, and it was a pleasure to be able to call those games. I still, in my days of calling junior hockey, have never seen a player who dominated as much as Eric Lindros did at the junior hockey level. It was a man playing against boys, and he was just a phenomenon to watch.
And just everything surrounding him was just hyper covered at that time. And do you think TSN being the only dog on the block that had that 24-hour sports coverage really propelled that into its own stratosphere like nothing had ever been covered before? Because, I mean, like when Gretzky came into the NHL, there wasn't a 24-hour news cycle. So was that part and parcel of kind of the hype machine?
Well, I think it was, it was even so, I would say it was kind of a light version of what we have today, because yes, there was a 24-hour, we saw the emergence during my lifetime as a broadcaster. I saw the emergence of round-the-clock news stations. CNN came to life, and then 24-hour sports stations, and yeah, you got to feed the beast, as they say in the business. So there had to be programming, and there had to be coverage, and I suppose that contributed to it. I think it's even worse now. With not only do you have to feed the beast, but you have a couple of different beasts to feed, and then throw in social media. And Snapchat and TikTok and everything else. Every team's got websites. So I think it's even more so now. But yeah, your point is well taken. I mean, you go back just a few years before that, you had an amazing player, maybe the greatest of all time, Wayne Gretzky, coming up, and in relative anonymity compared to even somebody like Eric Lindros a decade later. So it just continues to ramp up as you have more beasts to feed, to use my analogy. But yeah, TSN definitely contributed to it. Absolutely, I think in positive and negative ways.
Mm. Yeah, and I always thought at some point someone should have made like an ESPN 30 for 30 and just called it Everybody versus Eric, that would have just covered the Lindros' clashes with the hockey establishment. I mean, you obviously, from your perspective as someone who knows him, do you think that maybe still plays into his relationship with hockey in 2020?
You know what? I don't know. I don't know him well enough anymore to say that. I will say that even at the time, you talk about providing grist for the mill. Bonnie and Carl were. You couldn't have, you couldn't have written anything more outrageous, right? I mean, they were the ultimate, for better and for worse, they were the ultimate hands-on hockey parents, and it was an era where that kind of thing was reported more and more. I think there were probably loads of hockey parents like that prior to, but their insistence at dictating that. Where Eric was going to play, both coming into the Ontario Hockey League and then later going into the NHL. They could both be bombastic at times, and I think it was just this perfect storm that everybody got caught up into. So it was you look back on it and you kind of shake your head a little bit, but I guess it all turned out all right. I have no idea. I would suspect, and I'm just guessing, I would suspect that Eric's residence to be involved with the game to the extent that maybe we'd all like to see probably has a little bit to do with wanting to be a private person, but also I think factoring in there was the league's reluctance to take the concussion issue seriously, and that's essentially what ended his career. And the league, through its actions, basically said, nah, we don't think that's a factor, which of course is completely turned out to be incorrect, and I would think that plays into it a little too.
Yeah. Now, Paul, many sports fans will link your voice with the world under 20 hockey championship or World Junior. Now it's we try to ask evergreen questions, but it's supposed to start in about, I guess, 11 days in a pandemic, in a province with a sky-high COVID-19 caseload. I guess what is the best way to sort of make sense of health and safety and, I guess, cold, hard cash seeming to be on this collision course?
Well, nobody's asked me my opinion. In terms of what should we do? Why would they? I say that tongue firmly implanted in cheek. But if somebody did ask, I don't know why you wouldn't just this year go, you know what, we're going to take a year off. It's the prudent thing to do. And we're going to, this is a massive, massive moneymaker for Hockey Canada, and that's the main reason it's going ahead, I would say. And it may all come off fine. I hope it does. But, they canceled the Spengler Cup months ago. Again, just saying, you know what, in light of all that's going on, we're going to shut her down and not do it this year. I don't know why you wouldn't do that, but I'm not the person to ask that question. But if it were up to me, I think that would be the prudent thing to do. Would just be to say, we're going to set an example, and this year, just because of we're going to be coming out of the tunnel a year from now. It'll be fine, hopefully. But this year, right now, it's not. So we're going to lead by example, and just say, this is a year we're going to take off, unfortunately.
And I know in a more general sense, when we get back to some semblance of normalcy, how fair is it to say that really enjoying the World Junior, it kind of requires some sort of, a friend of mine called it active critical distancing, where you watch it for the quality of the hockey, but you kind of maybe push away a little bit from the nationalism angle that's become such a big part of it?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. Whoever said that, that's sports, right? I mean, we love hockey more than any other country in the entire world. We follow it more closely than any other country in the entire world, and that tournament means more to us than any other country in the entire world. So I guess you're going to get that. But yeah, I mean, what it became. I was there when we first started broadcasting the World Junior, and it's funny when I reflect back because I remember the first year I went to Fusen, would have been the 1991 World Junior Championship, I believe it was, 91 or 92, and my wife, having people at work, she had to explain to them where I was. Oh, he's at this World Junior. Oh, what's that? What's this tournament they have every year? It's the best junior hockey. It wasn't, it wasn't the all-encompassing thing that it is now, where even if you're not a sports fan, you can't escape its grip. You see the ads and you hear about it. It's a huge thing. I mean, until the mid-90s, we didn't even broadcast every single Canadian game at the World Junior. Never mind every single game from the tournament. I mean, it just changed by leaps and bounds. And in the early days, going overseas, TSN didn't want to pay the money to send a host and play-by-play guy and a color guy, so I was the host and the play-by-play guy. It's like it just grew exponentially during my 11 years of doing it. And the main reason for that is because Canada started to win. Like, remember, guys, this was not a tournament that Canada came even close to dominating until the 90s, when they won 5 in a row for the first time. And that just happened to coincide with the games starting to be broadcast on TSN, and it became a Christmas tradition to click on TSN on Boxing Day and watch Canada kick the crap out of Norway 10-1 and go, "Hey, Merry Christmas! Pass the turkey sandwich." I still maintain, had Canada not won the way it did during the 90s, it would not have grown into what it is now. Everybody loves a winner, If Canada had finished in third place, fourth place, maybe won once during that run in the 90s and not won 5 in a row, I don't think it would be what it is now. Winning breeds winning.
Before you came to Hockey Night in 2014, you'd spent about a decade in England when you and your wife moved there for her job. How did your time away from Canada, allow you to kind of reset and think about where hockey fits into life here? I mean, did it give you any added perspective, probably needed perspective, I'm imagining, for a lot of people that don't get to leave the country, that do cover the game?
Well, if only we could all go and live outside of our country for 9 years in my case. On a philosophical level, the world would be a much better place, because you see other parts of the world, you see things through a different lens, you see your own country through a different lens, and that's just a positive. It makes you appreciate your own country and perhaps make you more critical, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but just look at it in a broader light, and I think that would be the case for anybody. Specific to sports, obviously completely different sporting culture in the UK where I was living. I knew I was in trouble when the sport that I'd grown up loving and working around was referred to as ice hockey. I knew that I was in trouble right away. Now, having said that, I still was very much involved in hockey from a European standpoint. I did a lot of work for the International Ice Hockey Federation, traveling to tournaments all over Europe and in Asia for that matter. Working for them, I was doing web content and writing and producing videos and so on. I was involved in the Spengler Cup production as well as calling play-by-play. I did that every year for Canadian television. I was also called hockey play-by-play sport, which is a big pan-European sports channel. I did the Vancouver Olympics, all of the hockey on Eurosport. So I was still very much involved in the game. I wasn't involved in the NHL on a day-to-day basis, but again, in this era, it was pretty easy to watch games online, or there were a couple of stations where you could catch them late at night if you wanted to watch them live. So it's not like I went over there and didn't watch a hockey game or wasn't involved in sports broadcasting for 9 years and then popped up on Hockey Night in Canada again. Right. That wasn't the case at all. In terms of perspective, it does put the game of hockey into perspective in a big way. I referred earlier to there is one country in the English-speaking world that is obsessed with hockey, and you and I are sitting in it right now. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, I think the only other country that is even close to us, or maybe equal in terms of being obsessed by hockey as the number one sport without question, is Finland. After that, hockey's by and large a regional sport. It's really big in some areas, just like the United States, and almost non-existent in other areas. Sweden, soccer is bigger. Russia, soccer is bigger. Germany, basketball, and also sort of a sport called netball is a big sport there. So it's a big world out there, and hockey does not have a big place in the global sports world. And I know that sends many Canadian people running away in tears at the reality of it. But that's something I definitely saw not living in Canada.
Now, something I was curious about is the way a live sports telecast is produced in Europe vis-a-vis North America. Are there any sort of differences that you found when you first went into that realm?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think a good sports broadcast is a good sports broadcast. But I think in the weird thing for me as a broadcaster, doing games on Eurosport, or even for that matter when you go to the Spengler Cup, or when I used to do the World Championships for TSN, and you're taking a world feed, which for non-broadcasters is essentially there's one feed of the game provided for everybody to use, and you don't control the pictures, as opposed to an NHL broadcast, for example, where the Hockey Night in Canada broadcast is controlled by the Hockey Night in Canada director and producer. So they decide to see. So an example is if I'm the announcer and I start talking about Austin Matthews, in the truck, they'll say, okay, camera 2, find close-up of Matthews, take 2, and you go to Austin Matthews. If you're doing a world feed, which is typical at the Olympics or big events, then you don't have that control. So I can be talking about Austin Matthews, but the director and producer in the truck may decide that they're going to do a replay sequence showing the goaltender flipping the puck into the corner for the defenseman to go and pick up and move out of the transition. I have no control over that. So you have to react more to what you see in the screen. So some of the storylines would be a little different than, I don't want to get too television technical, but there's a sort of a standard way that we do things here that they don't always do over there. But that said, the pictures from the Spengler Cup, I would put up against any of the pictures we get from any Canadian hockey broadcast. Like, they're fantastic camera people, producers, and directors. They just have a bit of a different method.
In regards to specific calls, I watched in my research. I watched that you said one of your best calls was I think the '94 World Championships when Canada won. And then obviously most people, especially hockey fans, in recent years will remember the Austin Matthews 4 goals. But I wanted to ask you, and it'll lead into my next question depending on your answer. Did you call the last game at the Forum?
I did indeed, and that is one I'll never forget. Yeah, it was. Bizarrely, there's no way I should have been calling that game. I mean, that was that's a funny one on the league, right? You'd think the Montreal Forum, one of the most iconic hockey buildings in the history of the game. I know if I was running the league, it's going to be on a Saturday night, and it's going to be Montreal against one of the original 6, Toronto or Boston, or something. It's going to be a big deal. Instead, it was a Tuesday night against the Dallas Stars. but because of that, it happened to fall under the realm of TSN schedule at the time, and we had that game, and it was for a kid who grew up as a Montreal Canadiens fan, I was pinching myself sitting in the same booth that my broadcasting hero Danny Gallivan had sat in, and amongst others, and calling the final game at the Forum. So yeah, I did do that.
And so where does that rank amongst the great calls like the Austin Matthews and the World Championships for you?
Well, I mean, it's as an experience. I mean, I don't recall it being a particularly great game. It was an amazing night, just because of the stars walking out there, and I remember Richard handing the torch to Belleville, who handed it to Aurel Joliet, it was just unbelievable. It was mind blowing to see all of that in front of you. So that was really cool. And Howie Meeker was with us on the crew that night. I worked with Howie a lot back in my early TSN days because he was one of our between periods analysts, and I was a host for a while on the game. So Howie was there that night. And then I remember after the game, there's a place on Peel Street called Alexander's, which is a great little sort of French bistro. It's been there a long time, and I remember us all going to Alexander's after the game and having a late night bite to eat and a couple of beers, and then the sort of dishes got cleared, and Howie took out a cigar, and the story started. Playing against Montreal Canadiens back in the day. So for personal reasons, Neil and Nate, that's right up there for me as an experience. As an amazing game, it wouldn't make the top 5, but as something that I was lucky enough to do, yeah, it's right up there. It was an amazing night.
During the lockout of 04-05, some people may not know this. I actually didn't know this. You called Raptor games during the 04-05 season, which was a pretty wild season. That was the year Vince Carter got traded. And I think there were a number of hockey people that switched over behind the scenes and in front of the mic like yourself. And Gord Cutler, I think, produced television Raptor games. So how was that transition managed? Was there any, were people looking at you thinking, hey, like, why aren't we bringing in a traditional basketball play-by-play guy or producer?
I don't really know. I mean, the thing is, I was, one of the great things about TSN back in that era was if you were versatile in terms of what you could do as a play-by-play announcer or a host, the world was your oyster, because they had to do a lot of sports. I mean, I called play-by-play for everything in the early days at TSN. Beach volleyball, car racing, horse racing, boat racing, track and field, right on down the list. And what I also did do, we had a fair number of Raptors and at that time Grizzlies games that we broadcast, Vancouver Grizzlies on TSN. And I did probably about half of those games. And I also called play-by-play at the Sydney Olympics for the basketball, as well as at the Athens and Beijing Olympics. I did basketball play-by-play. So, while I'd never put myself up as an ace basketball guy,
right, I
had done and have done a fair bit of basketball play-by-play. So when I slipped in and did those Raptors games on the radio, it wasn't that big of a stretch, because I'd done a lot of basketball on television, including some Olympic games.
I just for time purposes, I'm going to jump ahead, and I want to ask you in terms of, and I know people always probably bring this up whenever they interview you or talk to you on the street, but we'll keep it to probably just one question here. And when Dave Schultz came on a few seasons ago, he had a book out called Hockey Fight in Canada about the fight for Hockey Night between Bell and Rogers and taking those rights from CBC, who had held them for so long. We talked to him, and I asked him, I mean, in the end of the day, does that deal, now that Rogers have it, seem similar to like the Lufthansa heist from Goodfellas, in that everyone associated with that deal has been knocked off in some way? There's, I don't know if you've seen Goodfellas, but is that an apt way to look at what has happened? Because no one seems to have been left around that was there initially.
Yeah, no, that's the first time I've heard that analogy, and it's not a bad one. But I always tell people, for reasons best known to themselves, that's the direction it's gone. But I stand proudly with the people whose careers had been scuttled or upturned. Mike Johnson, who I think is one of the finest color commentary voices in the game, wasn't good enough for Rogers. Nick Kyprios, after all those years, not good enough anymore. Myself, Dave Randorf, Darren Millard, Glenn Healy. That's a pretty good list, and that's not even counting the behind-the-scenes talent. A guy named Paul Hemming, for my money, is hockey director in the world. It's 1 and 1A. I guess he wasn't good enough anymore. So there are a number of Gord Cutler, who has had a major role with the Vancouver Olympics, hockey packages at both TSN and Sportsnet. He didn't cut it anymore either, apparently. So that's a good analogy and one that puzzles me.
Of course, one of George Harrison's songs, I think "What Is Life," was used to great effect in Goodfellas, which sets up a segue. The Walrus Was Paul. How long had you been champing at the bit to do something like this endeavor? Because I've caught about, I think, 5 episodes now, and I am hooked.
Hey, well, thank you very much. I'm thrilled to hear that, Nate, and be sure to visit the website, romicast.com, and check out our back catalog. As anybody who knows me would attest, I have as big a passion for music as I do for sports, and I just, I wanted something to do, and I just wanted to take a break from sports, and there was another podcast that I heard that sort of took a similar approach, and I thought that I could put a Canadian angle on it, i.e. talking to Canadian music people. and it's been just an absolute blast to do. It's a lot of fun, and it's something that I've wanted to do for a long time. I had the opportunity, and it's been really enjoyable.
Yeah. Now, Jim Cuddy was your first guest. Was it a case of where, okay, Jim Cuddy's doing this, maybe open the door for other guests like, hey, I better get on this as well?
I don't think that hurt. The guy who really deserves props, Jim Cuddy and Colin Cripps from Blue Rodeo stepped up when I asked them. Right out of the gate, this was a new thing, and that was very, very, and I will forever be grateful to them for stepping up and doing that. And another guy, Dave Bedini from the Rheostatics and the Dave Bedini Band, has been a huge supporter and has sent a lot of great musicians and Canadian music people my way. Stephen Page, another great guy who I got in touch with through his agent, and he got back to me right away. Said, "Yep, be great." Tyler Stewart, another Bare Naked Ladies guys. So there've been a bunch, but it certainly didn't hurt coming out of the gate with the likes of Jim Cuddy.
Yeah. The Tyler Stewart episode actually connected for me. Some dots connected between that and the life of a pro athlete, because Stewart related how, like, by the mid-late 90s, the Bare Naked Ladies had management that was just, going for market saturation, and they were dealing with all sorts of fatigue. Where I relate that to sports is, it's a small industry, but it is one that uses a lot of jet fuel, and climate change is a thing. I wonder how, as, fans, we can, set in, try to push leagues to maybe you need to, like, play fewer games and travel a little less. How do you get that message across to people when we're all cultured on, like, having 24/7, 365 spectacle in North America?
Well, that is a fascinating topic, and I think one that it's going to evolve certainly over the rest of our lifetimes. But you raise an excellent point. Whether you go for a more condensed schedule, or teams come in and they play, rather than coming in and playing on Friday, flying out and playing somewhere Saturday, and then coming back to that city 2 weeks later to play another one. Maybe we see things where teams fly in and they play a 2-game series. They play Friday and Monday, or something like that. I'm just spitballing here. I have no idea, but I think that the next generation of sports fans, of younger sports fans, are going to be asking those questions. Absolutely, and they should ask those questions. If we want to try to save this little blue ball spinning around in space, don't call home, we've got to be thinking about things like that. And is it feasible to have professional sports teams on chartered jets flying tens of thousands of air miles every year to play an 81-game schedule, when there are perhaps ways that you could cut those air miles in half, or by a third, or even by a quarter? Every little bit would help, and I think those questions will be asked. And you know what? It will be the intelligent league. And if I had to bet on a league to look at that first in North America, I would say it would be the NBA, because the NBA tends to lead on social issues and broader issues, and it will be the smart league that gets ahead of that, I believe, and says, you know what, this is what we're going to do our bit. And I hope it happens sooner than later, but it'll be interesting to watch unfold. That's a great question.
Yeah, and just quickly to drop in, I did see a graphic where the NBA is reducing all the travel for every team, and of course the Raptors had the smallest reduction, because that's just how it works. But Neil.
Yes. I was going to ask you, because, we're talking about the Romy cast and the Walrus Was Paul. Have you ever in your career gotten close to any of the Beatles, either using your media credentials for your own, selfish purposes, or just run into them when you were in England or in your, media travels?
The closest I got was when I was living in London, and there was an event that was being put on by a charity for people with hearing impairments. And stick with me on this. George Martin was a fellow of the charity because his hearing had suffered because of all the years that he spent in, George Martin, for those of you who don't know, was the producer for the Beatles and many others, and spent his entire working life in sound studios and mixing albums and listening to loud sounds. So he was losing his hearing, and he was a fellow with this charity. And what they were having one night was Sir George Martin by that time was being interviewed in a very small room, just a couple, maybe 100 people, so like a gymnasium, maybe smaller than that. And he was being interviewed, and he was going to talk about what it was like producing the Beatles. And I happened to see this was happening, and the tickets they weren't cheap. They were like a couple $100 each. But it was for a charity, and plus I wanted to see George Martin. It would be incredible to spend an evening in a room with this guy and listen to him tell stories about working with the Beatles. So I went, and just after the lights came down, in came Paul McCartney. And he sat about 4 rows in front of me on the aisle and was there, listening. And about a couple of minutes before the talk was done, he got up and he left. So I was 4 rows away from Paul McCartney. That was the closest I ever got. It was pretty cool.
There's a number of ways I can go with this last question. It just kind of broke up into about 3 questions for me, so I'll just bear with me on this one. So my last question may turn into about 2 or 3, but I guess I've seen in LinkedIn you've written in depth about the business of mainstream media, especially Rogers and the hockey deal. And sorry, I am going back to this. So now that you have your feet in the water with podcasting, I just wanted to see how you see the monetization evolving going forward with podcasts. And I only ask you that because you seem to have had an in-depth kind of breakdown of the Rogers deal, so maybe your head is in that space. Do you see a path forward for monetization in podcasting?
Well, if there is one, there is one, but the one that I see is, you've got to be pretty big, and I'm not that big. There are small ways forward for the little guys like me, and like you guys for that matter. And you can get affiliate marketing deals, and there's nickels and dimes. But to really make money, you've got to be. You got to have hundreds of thousands or millions of people listening, and at that point, again, I would point to Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell has enough people downloading his podcast that he can go to a big company and say, "Hey, do you want to sponsor?" And it's old-fashioned advertising. They'll write him a check and say, "Yeah, this is this panoply brings you Malcolm Gladwell's podcast." But for the smaller scale, I don't really know. I'm looking at it. I would love to find a way. Right now it costs me money to do.
Us too.
And that's not even factoring in my time. I'm the producer, researcher, writer, editor, everything. Mm-hmm. It's the same with you guys. But if there's a way that emerges, I'd be really happy. I don't know what that is yet.
There was a recent article, Bob McCown, in the Globe and Mail by Simon Hopt. I don't know if you saw that a few days ago.
I did, yeah, I saw that.
Yeah,
yep.
So in that, it came to my mind for a couple of reasons. And in terms of podcasting, he's saying his, is getting like 100,000 a month. And there was also the whole business aspect of his career. And since you guys are of the same era, roughly, I just wanted to ask you, was it an easier time? Because he seems to have a lot of business interests involved with sports, and I think you do as well. Was it an easier time back then to kind of, when there was less consolidation to get your hand in different pies and maybe make a few bucks outside of your traditional in front of the mic gig?
I didn't really get into that so much. I've always had the writing that I've enjoyed doing, and I've done commercial voiceovers and so on. But Bob McCown is a completely different league. I don't know Bob that well, but he is, just clearly a massively bright, entrepreneurial guy, with his production company and, all the winery that he was involved with and real estate deals. I mean, he's a guy who thinks like an entrepreneur. And, I don't know that, I could ever be, I would ever be accused of that or put in the same league. And even with his podcast, bless him, but I understand why he has all those downloads, because, I mean, he was the guy on a big radio show in a major Canadian market. I can completely understand where he would have that many people downloading his podcast. I mean, I don't have to tell you guys what 100,000 downloads a week for a podcast.
It's just a few more than ours.
Bob. So I never got into it the way Bob did. To answer your question, no, I never had that kind of acumen.
And the I guess also, just because I brought up the breakdown of the Rogers deal, now I think we're about halfway through it. I just wanted to know, I know it probably doesn't occupy a bunch of your time, you've moved on, but what do you see happening? I mean, not in the remaining years per se, but I mean, once this is done and maybe in the last few years, where is this left hockey broadcasting in this country, and where will it go?
Well, things change. The Hockey Night in Canada that I grew up with is but a distant memory. And people can argue whether that's good or bad. Things evolve. My guess is that and it's just a guess, is that in 6 years, seeing the way things go now, first of all, I would expect that if past form is any indication, Rogers won't even come to the table. And as Exhibit A, I point back to, remember when Sportsnet launched, and they launched by taking the regional cable television NHL package from TSN. I was at TSN when that happened, and there were a lot of long faces going up and down the hallways when that happened. And Sportsnet, over the course of that deal, clearly decided they had no interest for, again, reasons best known to those who made the decisions, but they clearly had no interest in being national NHL cable broadcasters, and I say that that's a fact because when the rights came up again, they didn't even put a bid in, and it went back to TSN, and it was ensconced at TSN for many years until this deal. So to answer your question, I think that in 6 years, I would be surprised if they even came to the table based on that past form. What I think is going to be the big factor in 5 or 6 years is there may not even be a place at that table for Rogers or Bell or any of the traditional broadcasters, because in my mind, once platforms like Twitter or Facebook or Apple or Amazon or any of those big companies, once they decide that they're going to step in, and I believe they will at some point, just imagine, guys, Apple Canada decides it wants to jump in and scoop up the Canadian broadcast rights for hockey. It's over. And you're talking about a company that has more cash reserves than most governments. It's done. They just, and likewise for a big platform like Facebook. If for whatever reason Facebook said, we're going to get into video streaming and we're going to get all the NHL rights for Canada or for North America, it's done. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the direction it's going, more so than traditional broadcasters.
Well, Paul, on that note, I do want to thank you, but I want to ask you, just going forward, what can we expect to hear more of in addition, maybe on the RomiCast banner? What can we expect to see from you going forward into 2021? And after that, yes, I'll close and say thank you for joining us.
Well, I want to. I'm going to keep going with the Walrus Was Paul for a little while longer. I'd like to do a second season. I'm going to wrap up the first season of 15 episodes sometime. I would guess probably February, March of 2021. And then there are a couple of other podcast ideas I want to explore. One is an audio history of, and it would just be probably a 3 or 4 parter of the early days of TSN. Because it was a remarkable story, a remarkable business story, and the likes of which I don't think we're likely to see again anytime soon. And another one I'd like to do with retired athletes. And the sort of premise around that is for them to talk about their careers, but also their life experience and how they intersect, and with a bit of a twist. So those are two other projects that I hope will come to fruition in 2021, and then later in the year we'll get into season 2 of The Walrus Was Paul.
Just because we had Serge Savard on in our last episode, and it just, when you talk about retirement, one thing it did get me thinking about was Ken Dryden in the game. I think he retired around 30, and he talked about being able to relate to 65-year-olds much more than people his own age, because they were of retirement age in civilian life. So yeah, after you retire from sport, you're definitely not on the same page as people that retire from your traditional blue or white collar jobs. So on that note, yes, thank you again for this much time, and we look forward to reading more and more of your Scholastic releases.
Thank you so much, guys. It's been my pleasure. It's been a really nice talk. I appreciate it.